Hello, and welcome everybody. Good afternoon. It's now afternoon. My name is Andrés Martinez, and I'd like to welcome you to our Future Tense event today entitled, Will the Internet Always Be American? I'm the editorial director at Future Tense, which is a project of Arizona State University, New America, and Slate magazine, focused on the impact of emerging technologies on society. We hold different types of events here and in New York, and we publish content daily on our fantastic channel at Slate magazine. We also publish monthly deeper dives into particular subjects, a feature we call Futurography. And we recently had a full month's worth of content on this question of who governs the internet, which is the question that inspired this event. And to give you a sense of the range of the types of events that we do, I should note that our discussion today is sandwiched between a recent, one of my favorite movie nights, where we showed Buckaroo Banzai, hosted by FTC Commissioner Terrell McSweeney. And our next event is going to be on the spawn of Frankenstein, because we're coming up on the 200th anniversary of the novel that bequeathed us that fantastic question, what could go wrong whenever we consider scientific and technological progress. So that event is actually next week, if you want to come here and geek out on Frankenstein. You can follow all of what we do in our content on Twitter at Future Tense Now. And I think in terms of housekeeping notes also, I just want to remind you about your phones. I should practice what I preach. And when we have Q&As, please be sure to wait for a microphone and identify yourself, as this is being webcast. So now the question that brings us here today, will the internet always be American? Of course, the question presupposes that the internet is to some extent and has been American, which I realize is a bit of a provocation. But I think it's an easy one to make as a business matter, and arguably a case that can be made, although maybe not as clear-cut, when it comes to values and culture. On the business front, I do think it is worth taking a moment to consider just how staggering it is, the extent to which it remains American-based companies that dominate the business of connecting people online to each other and to information. Especially staggering if you're a foreign company trying to compete with these US firms, or a foreign regulator dealing with these US firms. As Emily Taylor noted in one of our Future Tense articles on this subject, Google or its sister site YouTube is the most popular website in 95% of all countries. The operating systems running the devices that connect people around the world are either those of Microsoft, Apple, or Google, typically. And we tend to keep in touch and communicate via Twitter, Facebook, WhatsApp, Snapchat, Instagram, and be entertained by the likes of Amazon and Netflix, and so on and so on. This is all familiar terrain to us. The US accounts for roughly 22% of global GDP and about 18% of all global manufacturing. And yet when it comes to this new slice of the economy, the one that's defining our future, the one that boasted of lower barriers to entry, the US dominance and market share is far greater. And this in a slice of the economy that was born at a time of so much hand-wringing about American decline. So I think it's important to step back and kind of take stock of that and realize how startling and surprising that is. And the question arises, is this a triumph of American entrepreneurship? Is it because of America's openness to the best and brightest? Because we all know that it's not as if non-US nationals were not involved in forming a lot of these companies. A lot of these companies had plenty of non-US roots, but for whatever reason, they ended up being based in the United States. That may or may not change in the coming future. And then there's a question that I think is going to animate much of our discussion today about, is this US dominant role in this space also linked to a question of our values and our culture, and may that be changing going forward? So we tend to think of the birth of the internet and its expansion as a staple of globalization, and I think what makes our discussion here very timely also is we're in a moment of rising nationalism around the world, and where people also elsewhere are more wary of America's stewardship of this space, given revelations about surveillance programs that the US has been pushing, and rising tension between these US firms that have dominated the space and the US government. So, lots of ground to cover, and I really appreciate your coming today in this interesting time, and to have this great panel to start off our discussion. Let me introduce, I'm going to sit over here. Immediately to my left, we have New Wexler from Twitter. And to his left, we have Emily Parker, who is a fellow with Future Tense here at New America and is the author of Now I Know Who My Comrades Are. Emily looked at dissidents and their battles with censors in a number of different countries, and has an interesting background in journalism as well. And Rebecca McKinnon, who has been a thought leader on a lot of these issues here in DC for quite some time, and here at New America. She directs the Ranking Digital Rights program and is the author of Consent to the Networked. So thank you all for being here. Rebecca, I want to start, we were talking, I referenced the rise of nationalism nowadays, and as you know, and as some of you who've been to previous Future Tense events know, we're kind of nostalgic futurists here. We love talking about the history of how the future was seen, and I think we're considering a spin-off that would be called Past Tense, but I'm not sure how many people would come to those events. But you know, in emailing with you about this event and sort of looking back at your fantastic book, which has really stood the test of time, you had this great expression in there about digital Bonapartism, however you might say that. And so I want you to just talk a little bit about what you meant by that. Sure. and the relevance of that term and the idea behind it in today's environment.
Sure. Well, thank you, Andres, and for your kind words. And before I explain this concept of digital Bonapartism, I want to explain a little bit about kind of where that concept came from, or why I came up with that. Or it wasn't actually, there was a friend of mine who's a historian who suggested that term. But in Consent of the Network, I spent a fair amount of time in the book talking about how, you know, there was an assumption, particularly in the early days of the internet, that the internet is inherently a liberating force.
Right.
Right? That it's, you know, all you need is to put internet in something, and then democracy will result, and liberation will result. And I actually kind of started, when I started working on my book, one of the kind of core motivations was to debunk that a little bit. That while that was kind of one of the values that motivated kind of early tech companies and so on, another concept that I talked about in the book is networked authoritarianism. And it's basically the concept that authoritarian regimes are capable of evolving and adapting to the internet and surviving and thriving in the internet age and sort of bending the tools to their needs. And back when the book came out in 2012, and it was kind of on the heels of the Arab Spring, people were like, God, Rebecca, you're so negative. And, you know.
You weren't as negative as Yevgeny Morozov.
Well, no, I'm not, because
I
think that, you know, the internet has dark side and bright sides, and all the whole entire segment of the entire, you know, spectrum of human nature uses the internet, and everything we do, you know, all the different actors, governments, companies, you know, nonprofit groups, criminal groups, are all acting upon the internet and shaping it in different ways, right? And so depending on who's kind of working to shape it most skillfully, it's going to go in whatever direction. And so, which brings me to the digital Bonapartism, because I had a chapter that dealt with China and kind of this idea of how an authoritarian state bends the internet to its will. And then I had a chapter in which I talked a lot about Russia. And at the time I wrote the book, there was a lot of optimism about the use of internet activism in Russia and how it was going to kind of bring about greater democracy. And I use this term Bonapartism, which is actually comes from Karl Marx, you know, from the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, that book. But what he called Bonapartism is political leadership by a populist demagogue who seeks to legitimize himself through democratic rhetoric and trappings, right? Napoleon, he was talking about Napoleon
And you thought
kind
this was
of
very esoteric
warning,
stuff.
you know, my father's a historian, so I kind of like to, you know, speaking of past tense versus future tense, you know, there's a lot to learn from history. And so Bonapartism is the term used sort of, you know, that has been used in political theory for a long time to describe a fake Democrat who's using the rhetoric and trappings of democracy, who's actually a demagogic nationalist. Yeah, so, you know, what more do I need to say? And that Russia, under Putin, the Putin regime was becoming increasingly skilled at what I call digital Bonapartism, using the trappings of, you know, you're free to say whatever you want, but at the same time supporting what we call troll factories, you know, people who are paid to go and attack activists online and discredit them. In the meantime, offline, people being threatened for what they said online. But basically people saying, well, I'm free to say whatever I want on Kontakte, which is the Russian version of Facebook, and so on. And I also argued that actually China was increasingly using more of the kind of Bonapartist techniques. And while China's best known kind of in the West for what we call the Great Firewall and kind of heavy censorship, that one of the more innovative things in China is also very similar to what we've seen being perfected in Russia, which is monitoring of public opinion online, and then in a very targeted way, getting both paid kind of information workers as well as volunteers to go and attack and sort of manufacture alternative facts and kind of the type of public opinion they want to spread and astroturf around the internet and turn that into the reality that is promoted, while at the same time censoring the people who are trying to advocate other lines of argument within the public discourse. And so that's kind of, you know, and so we can all see this now spilling over into more democratic societies. But as I think my colleague, Ellery Biddle from Global Voices is probably going to talk about a bit more later, kind of the troll factories and sort of online attacks and kind of the use of online manipulation techniques and the use of fake news to go after political opponents and political dissidents is something that's been going on for the last decade in many parts of the world. There's just a piece that has been circulating online today about attacks against activists in Mexico, you know, using kind of paid trolls. You know, we saw it in Bahrain before and after the Arab Spring. We've seen it all around the Middle East. We see it all across Eastern Europe. We've seen it for years, and people have been tracking it. And so kind of the use of online manipulation, right. While people kind of feel that they're being free and part of these movements, is something that's been going on for a long time, and it's only just kind of broken through here in the United States and in parts of Western Europe.
And also just for pure surveillance, right? I mean, that's...
Sure, well, yeah, so
yeah.
The surveillance it goes along with it, and you know, in Russia and China, and other countries too, there's just a lot of tracking of who's talking online, right. and then it's, of course, combined in many countries with laws that make a growing range of online speech illegal, and people getting arrested for stuff they posted on Facebook, while at the same time, like the attack trolls have been going around sort of posting fake news about them as well.
Right.
But it's tough because, you know, one further thing I'll say, since I'm talking anyway, is that, you know, here in the States, I've been in a lot of conversation. I was in Europe last week at a conference, and, you know, a lot of very influential people calling for censorship as the way of dealing with this. Mm-hmm. And I'm just going to put this out here at the beginning of your 2-hour event, that is very dangerous. You know, in China, there's a law against spreading rumors online. It's used against anybody who is trying to expose officials for corruption, or, you know, any facts that are alternative to the facts that whoever has power wants to propagate.
Right.
So we need to be very, very careful, and also careful about just saying, okay, it's up to the social media companies to fix this problem.
I think that's a good
also very
segue to bring
dangerous.
in New.
Yeah.
We have the benefit of having somebody who is in one of the more influential players in this space, especially in the US these days. But let's step back and just look at, I think Rebecca's right, that early on there was a real euphoria about these technologies were going to spread, again I referenced American values, but they were going to spread freedom and post-Arab Spring, and that, you know, nation states that were more authoritarian were going to be powerless in the face of this connectivity that people all over were going to have, and there was going to be sort of this universal push towards freedom. Obviously, that euphoria was overplayed, and now we're in a more sober moment where we're having this reckoning that, geez, maybe the nation state has, you know, can be nimble in this space too, and can maybe sort of outwit the people who are demanding more freedom in these various societies. And while we used to feel that if you were connected, if you were online, you were, you know, individuals and civil societies were empowering themselves, now you hear more and more people saying, well, best to get off the grid to reclaim one's freedom, which is a real turnaround from where we were, you know, in 2009, 2010 with the internet freedom agenda. So that's kind of the meta backdrop. How does Twitter see the sort of trend line of where we were back then versus the moment that Rebecca has described? And how should we think about how these trends are going to play out as different nations are asserting themselves in this space? And even people might be, in response, asking for more censorship, asking for.
Sure.
So it's just an opportunity to.
Yeah, I mean, it is. I joined Twitter almost 10 years ago in March of 2007, and I remember sort of watching Arab Spring, and you see these democracy movements, you know, starting to flourish, and the early promise of that, and then, you know, as more people came online, you ended up, you know, social platforms went from being this sort of lone voice of the dissidents, you know, to governments actually using it. And, you know, at Twitter, we certainly want to encourage, government officials to use our platform to communicate with the people they govern in the world. And sometimes that means, government officials and politicians we support, and sometimes it means, you know, officials that we don't. And it has been, you know, what I think that certainly that's going on in the U.S., but I think around the world we, you know, do certain things in terms of like empowering dissidents. We don't have a real name policy, which a lot of dissidents actually find sort of encourages that type of speech. If a government is monitoring, you know, or at least trying to monitor certain people, there are plenty of activists who are pretty nimble and are able to speak their mind and find out ways. Or they also know, based on conversations with us and our history in the country, that we aren't going to turn over email addresses and IP addresses and phone numbers just because somebody's criticizing the government. So I think that part of that responsibility is with them in terms of, you know, they know the laws in their countries and they see the political climate, and then part of it is on us in terms of defending their voice and protecting them and their anonymity. So I think it's sort of a trade-off. I know that doesn't answer.
How many countries are you not in yet? I mean,
we are officially blocked in China, in and Iran, North Korea, but that tends to be more of an internet access issue. We're actually, a lot of people think we're blocked in Cuba, and we're not. It is also another like sort of internet access issue. We're certainly optimistic about Cuba right now. But Iran and China we're blocked in both of those countries. There are a large number of citizens who access Twitter via VPN. So.
Let's come back to that, but Emily, I want to bring you in. You wrote a piece recently where you talked about, I think your lead was about China being, for US internet businesses, China is a land of moral defeat. It reminded me of what people used to say about Afghanistan being the graveyard of empires, but China seems to be sort of a moral graveyard for US internet businesses. And the piece you wrote about was on Facebook's efforts to, you mentioned Twitter is blocked in China, and we all know Facebook is trying to get into China. And maybe that's an interesting case study that you can talk a little bit about in terms of the difficulties that some of these US-based firms, again, face when they're trying to navigate these countries that have different mores, and how do you think that they should balance the trade-offs?
Thank you. Well, thanks everybody for coming. So just quickly, I just want to refer a little bit to some of the points that Rebecca made before going to that, because Rebecca and I have been covering these issues for a while, and actually I agree with everything that you said. I think I sort of look maybe at a little bit on the other side of the coin. So I, again, agree 100% with all your points. I think there was a lot of euphoria early on about the democratizing power of the internet. I think the media went a little too far. I think expectations got really out of whack. My book focuses a little bit more, I guess would be a little bit more in the optimistic category, in that I do talk not about the power of the internet to like overthrow governments, but more about the psychological power of networks and how it really empowers individuals in authoritarian countries to fight for change. And I still believe that. I think now actually the pendulum has almost gone too far, in that now we're really in like the internet is bad. And I think we have to be careful of making the same mistakes. So much of it is about expectations. I mean, look at the Women's March that just happened. That is, one of the largest protests in decades, and it was organized on social media. It was someone in Hawaii who started a Facebook page. Now, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, this would have been the headline. I mean, this would have been like a jaw-dropping event, and now it's like, oh yeah, right. It's in maybe paragraph 12 of an article about it. So. Social media is still incredibly important, and it still does have that organizing power, and it still is. And if you look at a country like China, which I'll get to with Facebook in a moment, again, it's an expectation issue. Anybody who thought that the internet was going to unseat the Chinese government, like that's a problematic assumption, right? I don't, neither of us believe that. I think some people. And it's funny, when I did book events, people kind of would ask me that, like, well, if the internet's so powerful in China, why is the Communist Party still around? And I'm like, that's a weird question, because, why would the internet, just by being there, create a groundswell of Chinese unrest? I mean, that's not what the internet does. And I still say that despite all the very true points that Rebecca made, the internet has transformed China, right? It absolutely has, 100%. The Chinese government's still there, but I mean, the degree of news that Chinese people can get that they weren't able to access before, the degree of connectivity they have, the degree of access to other Chinese people all over the country, right? I mean, that is the most revolutionary aspect of the internet, which is that it used to be if you were in Beijing or you were in another city and you had some idea or you were mad about something that happened, you were alone. I mean, China is not the kind of place where you're like, hey, why don't 100 of us get together and talk about this, political issue? That doesn't go over very well. But now on the internet, you have these like massive groups of people talking about things all the time. Are they talking about starting a Chinese Spring? No, but they are talking about, pollution or about local accountability. So anyway, I just want to kind of bring that in there, that, it's like, I think we should just be wary of now going into like the internet as an authoritarian tool, like let's shut that down. Because I feel like that's kind of where we are a little bit. Anyway, about Facebook, so yeah, I mean, this is again the expectation problem. When US companies first started coming into China, it was like, they are gonna, Rebecca knows this better than anyone else, they're gonna liberate China. I mean, there was a lot of kind of really euphoric press about that, Google, Microsoft, Yahoo, and then kind of one by one, these companies were sort of taken down a notch morally, right? So you have Google, comes in with search, but it's like a Chinese version of search. So, Chinese version of Google News. You come in and you're given certain results, but it's not China that's doing this, it's Google that's doing this, right? So everybody was kind of like horrified, but then Google explained that, well, more news is good news, and it's better for us to be there than not be there at all, which is kind of the classic US corporate explanation. And people kind of bought it. People were like, okay, Google, like that sounds reasonable. Like it's better for you to be there than not be there at all. Then you have Microsoft, which shut down a blog of a provocative Chinese, pro-democracy blogger. You have Yahoo, which gave information to authorities that landed people in jail. So kind of one by one, all these companies that were like, we're going to change China with our American-style ideals, China was actually changing them, right? They were actually becoming sort of more Chinese in the way that they were operating. So I think for a lot of people, this was a real reality check about the power of American companies to transform a political environment. So Facebook is this really interesting example because Facebook clearly is on a mission to get into China. This has been clear for a long time. It's not a secret. Mark Zuckerberg has done really, he is just, and people mock him for it, but he has really gone above and beyond, to kind of make it clear that he wants to be in that market. And so, and I have said that I think they will eventually get into that market. I think they will eventually succeed, but it will be a compromised version. It will not be the Facebook that we use here. So anyway, I know we're running out of time. So.
No, we're doing okay. You said that the media went too far back in the day of fueling this euphoria. I want to ask New quickly, do you think the corporations like Twitter also went too far in pushing this narrative that our technologies will set you free? And to this day, when is it the Twitter worldview that you are spreading free speech and democracy? Or do you see this more as, hey, we've got this great tool that will allow people to connect to each other, but we understand that they're doing it in very different environments, and we're kind of neutral as to how it's going to play out?
No, it's an interesting question. I think that we generally try to be, when it comes to talking about the content on the platform, we generally take a pretty hands-off approach and try. There are certain times if there's something that is a trend that is going on, we'll make an effort to highlight that. But we don't say, okay, we are taking down governments in the Middle East, or we sort of see ourselves as, okay, we're facilitating conversations, and if these.
So you don't go into work every morning and say, we got to bring down some governments.
I do not. The second question was, the second part of your question was more about.
Well, I think that it's what you're getting at.
Yeah.
Is whether the mission is to allow people to connect with each other in whatever way is appropriate and in their environments, or is this more of a sort of missionary sense on the part of the company that we are spreading, what these American or Western or pro-free speech values? Is that?
Yeah, look, we are. I think right now about. I don't have the exact numbers. I think we're about 320 million monthly active users. Roughly 3/4 of them are outside the U.S. So to the sort of the title of this, this panel, right. I think we're an American company, functioning globally, and sort of. I think there are occasionally times where we can sort of export the First Amendment,
right.
To other places. But I don't see like our position is more, we want to be the platform where somebody wants to know what's going on if they're watching a sporting event or they're at a protest and they want to be connected with other people who are in that moment.
Yeah.
So.
And Rebecca, also on this question of, I felt like Emily really picked on the media when she said the media overplayed this. Mm-hmm. I feel like the media overplayed it.
Everybody.
But let's talk a little bit also about sort of the
the role that Washington and the U.S. government played. Emily, you were in the State Department, but at the so it's all on you. No, but
You're
at the
accusing me
time
of
of
overplaying.
at the time of when Secretary Clinton was at the State Department, there was a big push on internet freedom. Our program here at New America was involved with that. But Rebecca, when you look back at that period of time, and whether or not there was sort of a zealous missionary impulse to export certain values and agenda through this technology, do you think that the U.S. government overplayed that message and its hand, or was that sort of a worthy effort that should continue?
Right. Well, that's, I guess my response to that is very complicated, and just sort of, I have to disclose my conflicts of interest here, is
Thank you.
that I currently run a project that receives funding from the State Department Bureau of Democracy, Rights, and Labor under their Internet Freedom
Okay.
program. So I want to disclose that so nobody attacks me later for, being, bought and paid for or something. On the other hand, I've been involved for a very long time, wearing hats from various different organizations in debates around kind of what internet freedom is and what government policy should or shouldn't be in this area. And there was actually a debate that went on at the very beginning of the Obama administration, kind of when the Internet Freedom Agenda was being formed, about what that policy should be. And there was sort of a certain set of people in DC who were really advocating that the Internet Freedom Agenda needs to be all about funding circumvention tools so that people can use the technology to get around censorship, and all of the money needs to go into that. And if we put all the money into that, then like the Communist Party will fall and the Iranian government will fall, and I mean, one heard that argument on the Hill. And there was actually quite a bit of a debate about kind of what the US ought to mean when it says internet freedom. And I think it's a little bit like a Rorschach test even now, that if you ask everybody in this room what internet freedom is or what the US government internet freedom policy is, you'll get different answers. Or what it should be, you'll get different answers. And I don't think there's actually consensus within the government about what it is, or even within the State Department. So kind of that said, I think internet freedom, in the way I view it, is a subset of human rights. Or that, if I have to articulate my opinion about what internet freedom ought to be, and so therefore it's kind of appropriately, at least within the State Department, under kind of the Human Rights Bureau, right? The bureau that deals with human rights. And so to the extent that the United States is promoting human rights, as relates to the internet, I'm all for that, because I'm for the promotion of protection and respect for human rights generally. So, the extent to which the policy has been that, I think, that I very clearly feel that's a good idea. There's more kind of complicated discussion about to what extent U.S. government funding, when given to certain groups, ends up being positive or negative for those groups, and so on.
And that's an issue.
And that's
that
part
goes
of the kind of
Yeah,
internet
let
freedom
me get
agenda
Emily
as well. But
Yeah,
so
that's a good point. Let me get Emily to also react to this question.
Sure.
And then also, just really quickly, I'm curious, when you were reporting your book and getting to know, some of these activists and bloggers in Cuba and Egypt and Russia, I mean, to what extent did they feel that they were tapping into the sort of American infrastructure and American values, or was it, from their perspective, more fully a domestic endeavor? They connected to sort of universal values. I mean, just kind of bringing back this question of America's role in all of this.
Sure. So first State Department and then that. Okay. So again, Rebecca's points are all great. Just quickly on the State Department and then on the U.S. government, I did work at the State Department, specifically working on internet freedom issues. So this is a topic I'm pretty familiar with, and I think one of the really interesting things is just how much the political climate has changed. the Obama administration in general is widely associated as being kind of like very idealistic about the power of technology. You know, this was like the social media president. And it's not just the State Department, it's the whole administration. And then I was struck watching his farewell speech and like didn't really mention the internet at all, except in a negative way, which is like you should get out and not argue with people on the internet. So it just, the mood has changed so much. And I think, you know, in terms of the State Department, one of the things that Secretary Clinton did is, you know, she made several major addresses about the power of internet freedom and kind of really put that issue on the map as something that like the US government saw as a priority. And I think that was really important. It was kind of an ideal. It was like, this is our ideal. And then, you know, since then, you know, we had WikiLeaks, we had Snowden, we had the entire world accusing us of a hypocrisy, you know, but I still think there is some value in putting that ideal on the map, just even if it makes the US more accountable, because it kind of did, right? Like once the US gets out there and says, we believe in internet freedom, and then everyone says, well, what about this and what about that? Like, that's kind of a good thing, right? So that's my thoughts on that. And then as for the dissidents abroad, you know, I will say that in China, yes, it is always a very domestic thing. I mean, they're always most concerned about like their own networks, but you know, they definitely did look up to American companies, right? And that's why this has become so problematic. I mean, I know, you know, even Twitter, which is blocked in China, has still had a certain power in China for a small group of people, right? Because Twitter is blocked, you have to jump over the firewall to get to it, which means that it's not censored, right? So Chinese activists will use Twitter to reach the outside world. And I've seen a few occasions over the years where it's played a very important role because, you know, if it's on Weibo, or one of the Chinese versions of Twitter, then it will be censored or blocked, but they can actually get their message across to, you know, US media or people outside, you know. And also with Google, I think, you know, the Chinese, when Google left China, there were flowers, and, you know, I mean, I think there was a certain idealized notion of US companies, and I think, you know, the Chinese as well have seen how these companies were compromised. You know, the blogger whose blog was shut down by Microsoft, Michael Anti, you know, I talked to him in my book, and he's like, I couldn't believe that Microsoft, not the Chinese government, shut me down. Like, that was just like, how did this happen? What kind of world do we live in now?
Let's take a couple of quick questions from the audience. We're yes, in the back there. And please wait for the microphone.
This may be outside the scope of this particular discussion, but I'm just wondering how the other forms of empowerment that the internet is credited with, like economic empowerment, you know, helping these poor farmers get decent prices for their crops, security for a lot of women who live in countries where they can't go out alone or without a male companion, and internet connection provides some safety. How does that contribute to political empowerment of the internet?
Becky, you want to?
I mean, it's all interconnected, definitely. You know, because somebody who gets online for business or educational reason, or you know, the ability to just engage with society in ways they couldn't before, it enables you then to become more concerned with issues. And you may be a farmer who's mainly using the internet to sort out your crop sales. But then maybe, you know, there's some regulatory issue that's affecting you, and then you find other people online who are affected in the same way, who get together and talk about, well, maybe we should go talk to our local politicians about, you know, so it's very, the economic and political empowerment actually are quite connected, I think. And certainly, you know, the freedom to connect at all is very much part of it. As well.
Let's take one more here in the middle.
Hi, Maurice Turner. My question is regarding the responsibility of social media platforms. There are folks who are on Twitter and other social media platforms who are amplifying their negative ideals and wishes in the form of violent threats, bullying, things like that. So what is the role of social media platforms or social media platform providers to make those areas a more safe place, a more civilized place, so that the positive voices can be amplified as well?
I think that one's for you.
It is. Look, this is something that's very important to us. We have struggled with this issue in the past. We are working on it. Back in November, we announced we were tightening some of our conduct policies, had some pretty high-profile suspensions. We are ongoing working on different types of tools that make it easier for people to report abuse. And then on the user side, tools that make it easier for you to filter out the things that you don't want to see. To Rebecca's earlier point about censorship, we know that there are some people in some country that may not want to see a certain word that in another country they don't care about or has a different use. So ultimately what we want to do is sort of give people the ability to control their own experience on Twitter. And essentially say, okay, I'm going to define these parameters, and I don't want to see things that aren't within these parameters. So.
All right, well, thank you. Thanks to the three of you. So we're going to have our second panelist come up to discuss data's yearning to transcend borders and boundaries. So Jennifer, Ross, Carolyn. So our second group of conversationalist panelists here is Carolyn Gwynn. She's the Director of Technology Policy at Microsoft. Ross Schulman, who many of you locals know, he's the co-director of the Cybersecurity Initiative at New America. I meant locals here in New America. Okay. And throughout Washington, of course. And he's the Senior Policy Counsel at New America's Open Technology Institute. And Jennifer Daskell is the Associate Professor of Law at American University and also has very interesting experience at the Department of Justice on these issues. Carolyn, I'd like to start with you. We had another very provocative, interesting piece that our editor, Tori Bosch, published on Slate for this package of Who Governs the Internet by Maria Farrell, a writer in Ireland. And she was, she had this, she was talking about, yes, there's this American belief in a free and open internet, but she says, you know, we're now in a moment where the alternative is becoming more and more the reality. And she says the opposite of a free and open internet is a series of national intranets that police content, intercept communications, and prop up failing states. But it's hard to completely share America's enthusiasm for the same internet everywhere when that internet happens to be so utterly dominated by US firms, one of the themes we discussed earlier. But this question of the internet becoming a series of national intranets with much more of a heavy-handed jurisdictional interjection of the nation state, which was supposed to, you know, we used to talk about almost like an obsolete relic, you know, in those days of internet euphoria. I want you to talk a little bit about how Microsoft, which your entire business is predicated on this notion of the cloud, right? Cloud computing, and we all can store and share content on this cloud. And the idea of a cloud, just by its the way we think of it, presupposes that we don't necessarily have these nation-state boundaries and these intranets, you know, carving up the cloud in the sky. I mean, that's just if we had an illustration for what we're talking about. So I think it's a way to get at, you know, the challenges for you at Microsoft, and if you want to talk a little bit and react to some of what's been said here in terms of the tension between the initial ideal of an intranet that transcended boundaries and borders and the present reality.
Sure, thanks very much. And how much time do I have to answer that question?
About 78 seconds.
No, you're absolutely right that the tension is there between the need to respect local laws and national sovereignty and the impact of and the potential impact of a borderless cloud, right? Referring back to some of the comments that were made in the previous panel, as a technology company, we believe, in fact, our mission statement is to empower every person and organization on the planet to achieve more. So that's our mission. You were asking about, what are we looking at, toppling governments? No, we're looking to empower people. And the cloud, as we look at it, is a unique technology that will enable transformation of national economic development. Now, Rebecca talked a lot about human rights. One part of human rights is also economic, social, and cultural rights. And as I've been involved in the international, the global UN discussion on these issues over the past few years, we're seeing this recognition. So at the same time that the US seems to be saying, the internet is bad, there is starting to be recognition by some governments who had previously been very much anti sort of the multi-stakeholder process, who are starting to see the importance of involving all stakeholders in the maintenance, governance, construction, development of the internet because of this enablement and empowerment of the social, economic, and cultural rights, and how the internet enables that. So going back to your specific question, which is what about the forces that are fragmenting the internet at the application level as a cloud? So as a cloud company, and we released a book on that says, sort of the policy roadmap to enable cloud, we absolutely recognize the impact and the power of complying with local laws and the rule of law. This is what Microsoft has done, which is sort of at the base of the Ireland case. For those of you who aren't familiar with the facts of the case, this was in 2013 when the US government came to Microsoft to ask for an email that resides on our data center in Ireland. And what we said back to the US government is, look, you need to go through the legal process to work with the Irish government to obtain that piece of information, because that's not, we don't own that information. And so therefore, and we put the US government to court. Now, as of last year, the US Court of Appeals agreed with us. And this is a point that we've made, which is that in order for the cloud to be able to transform national economic development and enable SMEs, right, which at the end of the day, 95% of the corporations in the world are SMEs, and they control, the majority of employment as well. So we strongly believe in using this platform for enabling those economic and social rights. However, in order to do that, people have to be able to trust this platform. And part of that is the rule of law, is the predictability of the rules by which all corporations have to play by, and what our consumers and customers have the ability to put trust in. And along with that comes a set of principles such as privacy, transparency. In fact, we've taken the US government to court some other times also to enable transparency and also compliance with local laws. So as we operate in different countries in the world, we do recognize that different countries have different laws. So we do have different cloud models as well, in terms of enabling governments to put certain part of their information in a private cloud, in a global cloud, in a hybrid cloud, or even a national cloud. And all of those models are in the works. However, in those conversations, we make very clear what are the trade-offs, what are the costs. And it does take a really holistic conversation about economics, privacy, national security interests, etc. And it does really take everybody to come to the table to have that conversation.
Thank you. So this case involving Ireland is actually a really interesting case study to talk about some of these jurisdictional
Absolutely.
Issues, and maybe you can help us out here, Jennifer, because you're going to be all of you are going to be far more familiar with I seem to recall it was a case about a narcotics case, and you want to just sort of like unpack it a little bit for us?
Sure. It's actually an interesting day to talk about it because there was an appeal to the Second Circuit for a rehearing en banc, which was denied in a split vote, 4-4. So it shows just how contested and controversial and really open some of these issues are.
It was denied today?
Today, yeah, and that doesn't often, this morning.
We knew that when we arranged this.
It doesn't often happen that you have a 4-4 split in a rehearing en banc petition. So just to go back a moment, this case started several years ago when the government served a warrant on Microsoft for emails associated with a particular account. Microsoft refused, said the data is located in Dublin, Ireland, and they refused to turn over the data. The government fought back. They said, well, you, Microsoft, are actually based in Reading, Washington. and you can access the data here. The question was, is this an extraterritorial search or a territorial search? So Microsoft said it's extraterritorial because of where the data is. The government says, actually, you guys can get it here. It's territorial. It's perfectly valid. The second, after the lower courts all ruled in favor of the government, the magistrate and the district court, the Second Circuit ruled in favor of Microsoft.
And I'm sorry, was the individual involved whose emails they were trying to get at a U.S. national, or?
We don't know. It was never. It's
Oh, we
never
don't know
been
who the-
specified.
okay.
So that it's unclear what the
That's
nationality
not
of
the
the
issue, right.
individual is. And the Second Circuit ultimately reversed, sided with Microsoft, and today the government's rehearing for petition. The petition for rehearing en banc was denied in a 4-4 split.
Can it go to the Supreme Court now, or is that the end of it?
No, they could appeal
They
to the
could go to
Supreme
the
Court. I mean, whether or not the Supreme Court takes it, obviously,
Right.
is an open question. But I think, actually, the case, I mean, going back to your earlier question about the concern about kind of a balkanized internet, and, I mean, clearly, nation states are going to continue to assert jurisdiction over the internet. Clearly, we're not going to have the kind of utopian vision of a transnational world based on the growth of the internet. But at the same time, I think decisions like this actually encourage some of the balkanization, which is concerning. They encourage data localization because what this case says is that the location of the data matters more than anything else, more than the government's interest in the case, more than the nationality of the target, more than the location of the target, more than any other factors that you might want to take into account in determining whether and in what case a government ought to have access to data for law enforcement purposes. And I'll just say one other thing quickly about this case. It was described as many by a privacy win, and even in the, there's an opinion supporting the denial of rehearing en banc that also continues to describe this as a privacy win. I don't think that's right. Here the government proceeded by warrant based on probable cause. That is a higher standard that applies than in most other countries. And so the end result of this opinion is that if the US government now wants data that's located in another country, it has to use a mutual legal assistance treaty process or other mutual legal assistance process, which means the US government goes to a foreign government and makes a diplomatic request for that data. That foreign government accesses that data according to its own local procedures, which are often, in most cases, if not all cases, less privacy protective than a warrant based on probable cause reviewed by an independent judge.
And is it not the case that if I'm a Microsoft user and storing emails and other documents on this cloud, like I might not even know where they reside. So they could be in Ireland, but it's like my expectations are not really the issue because I wouldn't even know where they are, right?
Right. I mean, I think this case encourages companies and users to make location, to ask, to have the capacity to determine where data is stored. I think
Right.
that's negative in terms of thinking about an open and interoperable internet. So that's a problem. Currently, most users have no idea where your data is stored. And one other final piece about this, but interestingly, it was also described as a case about protecting Ireland's sovereignty. So Ireland filed an amicus brief in this case, and it was the oddest brief. Ireland filed this brief on behalf of Microsoft. But Ireland actually never actually asserted, they said, if you guys make a mutual legal assistance request, we will respond and we will comply and we will do it relatively quickly. They never asserted any conflict with their laws, and in fact, it was a very short brief. They actually cited a case, one of their own cases, in which the Irish Supreme Court basically said, we should have extraterritorial jurisdiction over data in certain circumstances. So even though this case was described as protecting Ireland's sovereignty, the Irish government never actually explicitly asserted any sort of sovereignty violation here.
Ross, how do we fix all this? How do we have a...
Well, so there's actually just to follow up on the point that Jen was just finishing making. So at least with Microsoft and say, take Amazon's web services, their cloud offering, you may not know where the data is, or you may know where the data is. If you spin up an AWS instance, you get to choose where it lives, at least by region, if nothing else. But there are other services, Gmail is a really good example, where there is no one place where the data lives. They shard it, they move it around the world for various reasons, including geographically diversified backup, and also if tomorrow you get on a plane and go to Brussels, they will move some of your email to a server that's closer to Brussels because that helps with latency. And so there's a whole bunch of reasons why they do all this stuff, but the end result is that there are a lot of different places where the data lives. And I think that leads us really interestingly to sort of like the overarching question of the Microsoft Ireland case, and a couple other things that we're sort of wrestling with right now are what metric do we use to determine jurisdiction over a piece of information? And the answer that the New York Second Circuit case gives us is the location of the data itself. Where are the bits written on a hard drive? And given the nature of the internet, my opinion is that that is the most ridiculous, stupidest possible way to determine jurisdiction over a piece of information. If that's true, I can simultaneously, 2 times a minute, I can change the jurisdiction of a piece of email if I want to. I can write a really easy script to do that. I'll have it to you by 3 o'clock. I can, if I would like to, ensure that every single country on the face of the planet has jurisdiction over a piece of data. I can find a computer in every single country and put that email on there.
How should the Second Circuit have thought of this?
So this is the question that we have to answer, right? When you say, how do we fix this? This is the fundamental nut of the question. How do we decide which government has jurisdiction over a given piece of information? And then following on to that, how do we ensure that other governments, if they need it for a good, legitimate reason, can gain access to it through legal means? And so my operating theory is that the owner of the data, and defining that as a ball of yarn in its own sense, but whatever the location of the owner of the data determines jurisdiction. And in this case, I don't mean Microsoft. Microsoft doesn't own the data in the way that I mean. I mean whoever created it.
Right.
The owner of the email, in this case, is me if it's in my inbox.
Right.
Or perhaps the author of the email if it was sent from somewhere. But yes, the essential question is, and all of the answers have trade-offs. One trade-off of the where is the owner located is, okay, well, if I get on a plane tomorrow to Cancun, well, suddenly now Mexico has ownership of the data. But that at least tracks somewhat with our expectations, right? If instead of an email, you're thinking of a piece of paper in a briefcase, if I get on a plane tomorrow with that briefcase and I fly to Mexico, yes, I mean, by and large, our expectation is that then the Mexican government would have jurisdiction over that piece of paper. And so, the idea that where the data lives at any given moment determines jurisdiction is weird, and I think even Microsoft sort of recognizes the really perverse sort of things that happen as a result of sort of the court case that they've engaged in, but it was the court case that they were presented with, and sort of that they didn't have much of a choice about that. But for an example of the really perverse incentives, so now the current law is that the DOJ ought to go to the Irish government and have the Irish government go to whoever's in the Dublin data center and say, hand over the email I'm looking for. But the Microsoft employees in Dublin don't have access to the emails. By Microsoft policy, they're salespeople. They're not, email data center engineers. They're not allowed to access the emails. And so the Irish government, the response that Microsoft will be forced, if this ever happens, to give back to the Irish government is, I don't have anybody here in Dublin who can do that. Go talk to the folks in Redmond. And so, and the DOJ is saying this now to Congress. They're saying, look, I can't get that now.
There is interesting legislation that was proposed, and I guess, I don't know where it stands now, that would make it so that you don't have to have the sort of strange diplomatic negotiation every time a case like this arises. And Jennifer, maybe you just want to quickly talk about that, because I know you two had an interesting disagreement about.
So there's two pieces of this problem. Yeah. So there's 2 different pieces of legislation, draft legislation, that are out there. One deals directly with the Microsoft Ireland problem. There's a piece of legislation that I'm not particularly fond of, but it's an attempt to address this issue by permitting, by clarifying when the reach of U.S. warrant authority. And to the extent that I like this piece of legislation, it ties jurisdiction more to things like location of the target and citizenship of the target. And I agree with Ross that that is the right approach. It also reflects kind of states' normative interests in regulating citizens and regulating people that are in their jurisdictions and one's own expectation of what state has jurisdiction and whose laws one must comply with. There's a separate issue, which is the issue that Ross and I have also worked on together, which is the question of foreign governments being able to access data that's communications content that's held by US companies. And the
Wherever it's located around the world.
Maybe. The same piece of legislation that's at issue in the Microsoft Ireland case also prohibits US-based providers from disclosing communications content to foreign governments. So foreign governments are experiencing the exact converse problem. UK officials are investigating a London murder. The target, the alleged perpetrator, the victim are all in London. And it turns out that they're seeking emails to help establish motive. And it turns out that those emails are not held by a British-based provider, but they're instead held by Google, their Gmail. And so they go to Google and they say, please turn it over. We've gotten legal process to do it. And they're told, no, we can't under US law. You have to make a mutual legal assistance request to the US government. It's a really laborious process on our end as well. It takes an average of 10 months according to a study a couple years ago. My guess is it's longer now because we kind of, as more and more data, more and more evidence, information is digitalized, number of things that law enforcement needs that's electronic increases, and you would expect there to be an exponentially higher number of requests. So long time to get requests. UK government's frustrated, and the question is there some solution that would allow foreign governments to be able to more expeditiously access data when they're investigating their own citizens, their own residents in connection with local crime? There was legislation that was proposed by the Department of Justice early in the summer in which it would amend the prohibition to allow the executive branch to enter in on a case-by-case basis executive agreements with foreign countries. And once those executive agreements were entered into, those foreign governments would be able to make direct requests to US-based providers for data of persons that are located outside the United States and are not US citizens in the investigation of serious crime. In order to be eligible to enter into one of these agreements, the foreign government would have to be certified by the Attorney General and Secretary of State as meeting kind of baseline human rights and rule of law standards, and the requests themselves would have to meet a number of criteria, including that they have to be particularized, of limited duration, reviewed by an independent judge. We can talk about whether or not all of those specific criteria are the right one, but my view is that this is the right approach and one that should be pursued, and it's consistent, I think, with the fix that I think Ross and I probably agree with is needed for the Microsoft Ireland case as well.
Do you have a reaction?
Yeah, so as you sort of teed up at the beginning, Jen and I had a fun little back and forth in public on the Just Security blog last, I don't know, October maybe, whenever it was. You guys can look it up if you want. About basically the implementation details that Jen just said sort of reasonable people can disagree about. And I agree that, yes, that those are the implementation details that we have to hash out. But I think the larger question about how do we address this problem is important, and that the DOJ's proposal that sort of went before Congress last year is, at least in its bones, what you would imagine would be a solution, right? It's not really the only solution, but it's one that we're all talking about. I think where the problems that we have are going to come around the idea of, which countries are allowed on that list. So Jen alluded to sort of, some sort of selection process, and I think the civil society community is worried about how that process operates, in that it's basically solely at the discretion of sort of the Department of State and the Attorney General. They just sort of get into a smoke-filled room and decide, so we want that to be a little bit more rigorous. Jen mentioned that there is a sort of independent, some sort of judicial review, but that's post hoc instead of pre-review like we have here in the United States. And then I think most importantly, so I'll do two more. One really important aspect here is that while, yes, there is some discussion of particularity, I think there is worry in the civil society community that the standard of proof that we're sort of discussing in this proposal is less than the US standard of probable cause. And we're very concerned about lowering sort of the bar to access of private data. And then finally, problematically, there's also provisions in there to allow for the real-time tapping of communications by foreign governments, which is seriously problematic. Here in the US, we've got all sorts of hoops that you have to jump through in order to gain real-time access to data, specifically because our Supreme Court has said that that kind of information is more invasive. So things like that are what we're arguing about, but the bones of how we might go about extending this kind of ability to foreign governments is sort of the same, and is important because those governments are taking other steps to get at what they want anyway, including, the UK government just passed a new investigatory powers bill that includes, provisions that would force private companies to backdoor the encryption on their systems, for example. So.
Thank you both for fleshing that out. And Carolyn, I mean, this really gets to the crux of a lot of what we're talking about in terms of, are we exporting and imposing extraterritorially American standards of due process and speech by virtue of the fact that these are US firms, that people are availing themselves to connect to each other. And, sitting at Microsoft, when criminal cases emerge in London or Mexico City or Nairobi, do you feel comfortable that it should be the local government that decides, whether emails need to be turned over, or is it realistic to expect that there continue to be a role played by the U.S. government in that determination? It's just this question of who is the sovereign of this cloud? In many ways, it is Microsoft, but when we start entering into criminal justice domain, it obviously cannot be a corporation.
No, it's not Microsoft because, as Ross has said, we store the data. We're not the owner of the data. Our customers own the data. So let's say, so what we've argued in the past is, in a pre-internet world, the government would have to go directly to the customer, the owner of the data, the people who generated the data, in order to get access to this data. So lacking the framework that you guys were discussing, we've had to do an interpretation to try to figure out how do we comply with the laws in the countries that we operate in. And so that's where we ended up, essentially with the Irish government is, that's wherever we operate, we have to make sure to comply with those laws for the operation to happen. That's just, normal business operations. And I think that as these issues get raised, hopefully there will be a legal framework that makes sense. It's very, very difficult. You've got experts here arguing about it, but that's what that has to be there in order for us to do the operation. It's not the role of a private corporation to make laws, although we are being forced increasingly into making these decisions because the regulations don't exist. The policy haven't really caught up with the technology. To the point of MLAT, I do want to give sort of one example which is counter to the 10-month delay that I've been hearing about quite a lot, which is in the case of Charlie Hebdo, for example, right? The French government went through the MLAT process, and with the understanding that that was a horrible incident, we got the order at about 5 o'clock in the morning, and 45 minutes later, the information was given back. So there are cases, extreme cases, where those processes work, and the point that's being made here is the existing policy framework and regulatory framework is out of date and needs to be updated, which is what the conversation really needs to be about.
Emily mentioned in the previous session that one of the cases that may have given U.S. firms a black eye in China, at least in terms of the public perception here, involved an activist and Microsoft. And I wonder the extent to which nowadays the company feels that it needs to stand up more to governments as a result of some of the cases in places like China, but then also to the U.S. government, given some of the revelations post-Snowden, et cetera. I mean, is there sort of a resolve within the company to be perhaps less deferential to government demands? Has that changed over time?
Thank you for the easy question. So you know that we've sued the U.S. governments 4 times over these kinds of issues, right? The Ireland case, the transparency case, the FISA court, and a recent case. It's all around transparency, et cetera, these kinds of issues. With respect to foreign governments, we do try to work with them, but then, and then every corporation has to make certain decisions that makes business sense. Now, one of the examples I do want to put out there has to do with China. The earlier case from the Yahoo journalist, if you remember that. Yeah. And out of that, we together with Yahoo and a couple of other companies formed the GNI, the global, in order to have a conversation around human rights and what does it mean to operate in a country, what are the corporate responsibility, et cetera, to try to address some of those issues. These conversations will continue.
Okay. Let's take a couple of questions from you all. Reactions? Yes, in the back.
Ross mentioned our expectations around jurisdiction when he was talking about a piece of paper in your briefcase and crossing over from the US to Mexico. And I'm wondering where that intersects with the question about, or the comment about how we need to have a conversation about updating our regulatory framework that lets us know under what circumstances a company should cooperate with a request, and how can you have a who should you include in that conversation? How can you build a framework that is resilient to broader concerns and not just representative of the issues of the moment? You could imagine if we did it now, we would maybe agree that in certain terrorist incidents or child pornography or certain issues, how can you update that framework to align with changing public expectations?
So that's a really good question, and it's actually a question that plagues a lot of tech policy, right? And the answer is that it's very difficult. So the law that we've sort of been talking around for this entire panel is called the Electronic Communications Privacy Act. It was written in 1986, so it's 30 years old now. Hasn't been materially modified since then. It's been tweaked here and there, but the major provisions of it are still the same. And actually, that law provides that the government can get access to your email if it's older than 180 days, which I guess made sense in 1986, but clearly doesn't make sense today, right? Nobody in this room would imagine that 181-day-old email sitting in your Gmail account or your Outlook account is sort of any different than a 179-day-old email, but it is in the eyes of the law. I personally have been working with some of the people in this room to change that for, I don't know, Greg, 9 years? 2010? Oh, is that 7 years? So 7 years to get Congress to amend that law to represent what is really just a bog standard, just look at it, it's obviously wrong, part of the law, and we still have not succeeded. And so long answer to your question is, you write these frameworks really, really carefully the first time around, and then just hope to God that you can get together enough momentum when they need to be changed to get them changed. But it is not easy.
And I would just add, so the jurisdictional questions that we've been talking about here were just not on the agenda in 1986. There wasn't a global internet. Yeah. And so in thinking about these jurisdictional questions, I think there's basically 2 broad kind of overarching baseline requirements. One, requests have to meet baseline privacy, human rights, due process standards. And second, jurisdiction should be tied to the things that normatively make sense. And so it makes normative sense for states, in my opinion, to have jurisdiction over people in their territory and citizens, and that reflects both democratic values, the possibility of democratic accountability, and any framework, I think, should operate from those 2 principles as guiding starting points.
Yeah, I think one last point to agree with that is that the whole thing we've been talking about has a sense of urgency to it, I think particularly on the part of the companies, because they are being put in the middle on a day-to-day basis of these really thorny questions. And so there is this drive to try to solve this as quickly as possible. But on the other hand, the delicate nature of how these systems interact, I think, does call for us to take a close look at it and not act rapidly simply because there's pressure, but to make sure that we get it right the first time, because changing it afterward is very difficult.
And then there's also, as a corporation, we also believe strongly in the multi-stakeholder process where we sit down with civil society, civil organizations, et cetera, through internet platform and engage with the internet community to look at how to resolve these issues, right? So we meet regularly with the human rights activists, as well as, for example, the We Protect initiative in the UK, which starts to look at, child online protection. So we do a fair amount of these work as well in order to address some of these questions as they emerge.
Here in the front.
Hi, my name is Jack Krapansky, unaffiliated former software developer and a Microsoft shareholder, and Twitter shareholder too, and Facebook. Question about LinkedIn in Russia. Are there any kind of principles that help us, and are there other situations around the world where they're trying to do a similar kind of restriction on where the data has to be?
That's a tricky question, and I'm not sure that I'm the best person to answer that right now.
I would say that, what I think the question is referring to is there's a new Russian law, or not so new anymore, but a Russian law that requires companies that are doing business in Russia to cache a copy of their residents' data in Russia. And we're starting to see, I think, a growth of these kind of mandatory data localization laws, and that's concerning, and that's another reason why delinking jurisdiction from the location of data is a good idea, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's right. I think data localization is one of the bad byproducts of linking jurisdiction to location of data. As far as how you push back on, as a company, on those sorts of demands is that it's very difficult. And Google, in response to the very same law, took the step of moving some employees out of Russia and into EU. Software developers, folks like that, who wanted to leave, basically to limit their own negative exposure. The poor CEO for WhatsApp not CEO, but country manager for WhatsApp in Brazil has been arrested like 3 or 4 times because WhatsApp is encrypted and they simply can't turn over data, and so judges have been jailing this guy who really has nothing to do with it, but in an effort to sort of pressure Facebook and WhatsApp, and so those sorts of things are really negative externalities of just sort of how we're thinking about jurisdiction of companies in general.
One last question for this group in the back there, and we'll move on.
So you guys have both said that jurisdiction should be related to citizens of a country and people in that country. Do you think those two have to be simultaneous, so as to protect political dissidents who leave a country or things like that? Or do you think that if one is a citizen of a country, that country should still have jurisdiction over their data?
My personal view is that they're two distinct tests, but they both, so the US, if the US is going to access data of a US citizen wherever they're located, they can do so by warrant based on probable cause. And conversely, if a foreign government is going to seek data of a US citizen wherever located, they should be required to go through the US system, because US citizens have some sort of control, democratic processes, knowledge, expectations of what those rules apply, and otherwise you allow all kinds of countries all around the world to be able to access US citizens' data according to their own standards. And I would expect and think that citizens of other countries would have similar expectations, again with the caveat that we need to do more to raise baseline rule of law, human rights, privacy protections globally in order for the system to actually operate in a way that I think is a positive way forward.
Yeah, I generally agree that the standard is either citizenry or physical jurisdiction over the body of a person, but the bulwark against human rights violations is actually in the system, or needs to be in the system itself, in 2 forms. First, that we don't let countries into the system who evidence human rights violations, and I would write that sort of question very broadly to exclude a lot of countries, probably. And secondly, that companies under the system still would have the ability to say no, essentially. All the system would be is a permission for the companies to work with other governments, not an obligation to do so. And so companies who receive individual inquiries that they're worried would have human rights implications are still free to say no.
Great. Well, Jennifer, I think there are a lot of interesting law school exams and all of this that your students can have fun with, and it'll be interesting to see if the Microsoft Ireland case goes to the Supreme Court, although maybe you don't want it to. But let's thank these panelists for a wonderful conversation. And now I'd like to invite the next. Actually, I think we're going to have Hao Wu first. Hao Wu is a former fellow here at New America and a well-known documentarian. I haven't seen you in a while.
Thank you.
And actually, I should mention, with a wealth of experience in the internet business in China, working with a U.S. company a while before you switched gears and got involved in making documentaries. But you're going to show us a clip of your upcoming documentary, and then we're going to have a discussion about online culture.
Okay. Yeah, so my new documentary is about live streaming in China. I don't know how many of you have heard about live streaming. So when you look at the history of internet's evolution in China, there are very few examples where that are truly unique to the truly uniquely Chinese innovations. One can argue Alibaba, when he started the business-to-business model, that wasn't a direct copycat of any successful model in the US at that time. And then, but the rest of the Chinese giants you hear about, like the Baidu, the search engine, it was directly modeled after Google. And also you have these portals, and you have Weibo, which is a copycat of Twitter. One could view that. But other than Alibaba, I've been really curious because I worked in Silicon Valley for a number of years, and then worked in the Chinese internet for Yahoo China and Alibaba, and also for TripAdvisor in that market. So I've always been curious about what kind of innovation can happen in China. Nowadays, when we look at the Chinese internet landscape, some of you have probably heard about the Tencent's WeChat. WeChat, I personally, most of the Chinese I know use that app. That app is almost like a, personal life OS. So Chinese people spend a lot of time on WeChat doing all kinds of transactions and social interactions. But live streaming is another phenomenon which I discovered 2 years ago that has been phenomenally popular in China, but not so much elsewhere. So let's take a look at the phenomenon.
Hello， 大家好，我是雨萌。晚上的8点，我们锁定 YY 频道304里面带来的
每一次直播准备，凹造型，准备好直播内容。维护好粉丝，维护好消费者，然后你就是神一样的存在。
他们有的时候有一点太夸张了，其实没有那么多，1个月就20几万。感谢现场每一个刚刚给我刷票的兄弟们，谢谢大家。
今年上千万，我刷礼物就是那种特别会有一种成就感，就感觉被人抬的位置特别高。
现在我才18岁，我出来打工4年。就感觉自己挺孤单的，想找一个人聊一下天啊，说一下心里话，很难很难。
现实你可能很多东西你达不到，你做不到，但是在网络当中你可以。
不过我们这一辈也是你的上辈，是我们这一辈的这个骄傲。
我都有一句话说白，一我不能倒，2我还得往前走。
对。
说实话，一家人什么收入都没有，全靠我自己一个人来。不开心了还不知道对谁说，
你没法去纹一个啊。我纹了，不好看。你整的鼻子？
对啊，这样也行。
眼睛？
对啊，
下巴？
对。
的未来，我在等一个人指导我怎么走，该走哪一条路。
就是这个电脑的原因啊，它给了我很多，但是也让我失去了很多。
生活没有什么方向，到现在呢，既想要又想要钱，反而让自己就是身心不坦。
这些东西都是狗屁，有钱你就是大爷，没钱谁认识你啊？
So also joining the conversation, we have to the far left, Ellery Roberts-Biddle, who is the Advocacy Director at Global Voices and a Fellow at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society, and Joshua Keating, who is one of our future tense partners at Slate magazine. He writes a lot on foreign affairs and particularly gifted at writing at how things occurring in the US are perceived overseas, among other subjects. And how has this been released?
No, it's still.
I said upcoming, but
it's
I wasn't
upcoming.
quite
Yeah.
sure. Yeah.
Editing's taking a long time.
For those of you who haven't seen it, I highly recommend you watch Howe's previous documentary called The Road to Fame, which is a look at Chinese high school putting on a production of the musical Fame. And it's terrific, and it's a wonderful way in to talk a lot about sort of intergenerational change in China. It's really fantastic.
Thank you, Andres.
So, well, we talked in the previous session about the balkanization of the internet, sort of at a jurisdictional level, and what had happened to the promise of this open, free, universal internet. And I think now we want to shift gears and look at that sort of question more on sort of at the cultural level and in terms of how we engage with the internet. And so that's why I was really interested in getting Howe's perspective on having studied how people interact with the online space in China. And again, we can sit here and say, well, this was a gift that these American firms give to the world, and yet in reality, maybe people's ideas of how they're connecting and what they're doing online will also differ tremendously from country to country. So you've heard a lot about this theme of whether or not the internet's being balkanized, and if you want to just talk a little bit to get us started, how about that against the backdrop of the work that you've done?
So I think when we talk about internet, there's different ways to look at internet. Internet is a technology, and also internet is also there are a lot of internet applications. So primarily because I started my career as a product manager in the internet space, and also now I'm a filmmaker also making products. So I tend to look at what are the business applications that internet brings, and also what kind of consumer needs all these applications or technology are trying to satisfy. So when I worked at Yahoo China, Alibaba, I was helping, because at that time Alibaba claims to have bought Yahoo China, but Yahoo views that divesting their assets,
right.
But they become, in that process, they become the largest shareholders of Alibaba. So I was helping localizing a lot of the advertising technology from Yahoo US into the Alibaba group locally, and later working for TripAdvisor, trying to bring the TripAdvisor, the travel meta search and review platform into China. So a lot of time I spent thinking about these American technologies platform that have been proven so successful in more developed market. How can we adapt those technologies or those applications to satisfy local consumer needs? But in that process, I think a lot of the online needs are like human needs are common. Like people want to search for information, people want to consume information. Also, people want to be entertained and want to connect. So some of the platform and technologies that actually the vast majority of the American technologies, internet technology, can be successfully implemented in China if they can find the right way to market to the consumers or to adapt, to change it, to adapt to the consumers. WeChat being a prime example. WeChat, WeChat started as almost like WhatsApp kind of copycat, but then they integrated so many new functionalities to satisfy local consumer needs. Right now, most Chinese people rely on this application on a daily basis. And live streaming is another one. Live streaming in the US, we see sometimes the live streaming is basically a chat room with a streaming window of the performer live stream their performance to people in the chat room. So in the US so far, we've only been able to find porn. Some porn sites using this technology. But in Asia, like in Korea, the eating broadcast is really popular. But I think in China, live streaming has really taken off to expand beyond eating, beyond, a lot of performers there singing karaoke or do dancing or do talk shows. But it really satisfies a needs in China. Also, the people who go on this platform, how they use this platform really reflects what China is going through right now, which is there's massive urban migration, urban alienation. People feel so lonely in the big cities, and because there's one-child generation, a lot of them also don't have a lot of friends, a lot of family members, siblings, and also because the wealth, enormous wealth gap in China. So a lot of the poor migrant workers, they love to go into this live streaming chat room to consume cheap entertainment content, to feel connected, they can chat with someone, also to try to witness other rich patrons spending enormous amount of money buying digital gifts, the kind of money they would never experience in their real life. So the way I look at...
I was going to say, it's cheap until you start sending gifts.
That's right, that's right. Don't go in there because you might get addicted and bankrupt yourself. But I think the way I look at the balkanization of the internet, in some ways it is happening because as the consumer needs are so different in each country, it's hard for me to fathom one size fits all, some of the technology that developed in the US, because I was involved in some of the development of, for example, TripAdvisor technology. But when you migrate that in China, it just doesn't make sense.
Ellery, I'd like to bring you into the conversation. We've been, Global Voices is a pretty unique platform for citizen journalists and advocates in, I think it's more than 150 countries. I mean, these 168. Well, that's more than 150. I mean, these are really the people on the front lines of a lot of the issues that we've been talking about today in terms of the tug of war, in terms of free speech and censorship and regulation and people trying to achieve change. And you heard us talk about this arc that the internet and how we talk about it has gone from the early euphoric days to Emily saying, let's not go too far now and saying it's all bad. But so sending a Global Voices and standing up for the people that are trying to tell these stories in some countries where it's not so easy. How do you think of how expectations have shifted and maybe vary from country to country or not in terms of the rights that we have online?
Sure. So Global Voices, I bet most of you know it, but we're a very decentralized community of writers and many of us activists with a human rights frame and agenda in many parts of the world, writing in English, but also a lot of other languages. And I am our advocacy director, so my corner of the community deals with people in the community and close to it who are doing independent media work or activism with a nonviolent civic intent who have experienced some kind of threat because of that work. So it's kind of rough out there. And it was interesting listening to the jurisdiction conversation because I found myself thinking, it's been a while since I've edited a story about a company that wound up handing over somebody's data to a government. And by somebody, usually for us, that means activist or journalist, somebody working in the interest of human rights. 95% of the kind of cases that I'm working on stories about or doing some advocacy on, often in the background, come about from expression on social media that is public or public enough that it gets seen naturally. You don't need a complicated, you don't need an MLAT process or even a complicated surveillance system to just pay attention to what people say on Twitter or Facebook, or even on more private, so Facebook is like a semi-private space. WhatsApp and WeChat have those qualities too. But if you have the right people that manage their way into what feels like a private space, who are then willing to share that information, you wind up with big trouble. So I just, for the fun of it, I made a little list of countries in the last 6 months where I've edited a story about somebody getting arrested for insulting either the chief executive of their country or a national agency. So that includes Algeria, Bahrain, China, Egypt, Iran, Jordan, Kuwait, Kazakhstan, Morocco, Oman, Saudi Arabia, Tanzania, Thailand, and the UAE. So that's a lot of places. And none of those were all cases where, pretty plain and simple, a piece of speech was seen, and whether that person's identity was just open and available, or somebody had to do a little work to figure out who they were arrested, and many of them prosecuted. So that's kind of one side of the equation. Another side is targeted surveillance through tools like Hacking Team's remote control system that I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with, but this is many governments, including the United States government, have spent millions of euros on this software that you need only to send to your target. So if I wanted to spy on your emails and see what you're doing on your computer, I'd send you a friendly email with a link to my latest post, and then you'd click it. It's not my latest post. It's bad software that'll get into your computer, and then it'll let me see everything that you do and say. So.
Yeah, there wasn't a story linked when I clicked on it. I was like, I just assumed it was an oversight.
So there's quite a lot. There's a lot out there, and the Hacking Team example really mostly has to do with governments, but in terms of threats that people experience because of their speech on social media and online, it's not limited to governments. It's, there are other kinds of organized crime groups, drug cartels, violent extremist groups, or terrorist groups, if you want to call them that are watching what people are doing and saying, and
so that's a long list of countries, and these are very sophisticated techniques you're describing, but has the balance of power, to be very simplistic, between individual and the state shifted from where it was 3 or 5. If we were having this conversation 3 or 5 years ago, would the landscape be more bleak or equally bleak, or has the state sort of emerged more dominant in this space?
I think in some places, a lot of my colleagues in the Middle East would say that the state has emerged more dominant, and it might be sort of so simple as that you can experience a grave consequence for engaging in this kind of speech online. If you're willing to take that risk, then go ahead. But I think and now it's been some years since the uprisings in the Arab world, and there is a little bit more institutional knowledge and memory of the kind of consequences you may face in the immediate term and over the long term. What happens to your family? What happens to your job? When you're 22, you're like, yeah, fuck the government, and then it turns it, and then once you have a kid, that's with our community. That's been very much, there's been this sort of.
Right. Well, Josh, we've given you a lot to react to, and also I want to make note of the fact that we've been here for over an hour and a half, and we have not said the words Donald Trump. The name Donald Trump.
We can do that.
So I'm gonna invite you to do it. No. We were, one of the themes we've been talking about is the Americanness or not of the internet, and sort of countries around the world asserting themselves more, and sort of nationalism being emergent in other parts of the world, and of course here as well. And so we have a new administration which talks about a lot of these themes in a very different way than the way Emily was describing the early Obama administration talking about internet freedom. And we have, a president and with a mandate to a certain extent to have this theme of America first. And I'm curious if, to the extent to which you feel that is going to change the dynamic in terms of what Russia and China and Morocco and name your country is going to feel about the latitude that they have in reasserting control over their, slice of the cloud, if you will. Where do you see it's day 3 or 4, I'm losing track of the new administration, but going forward, is there going to be any impetus or credibility for the U.S. to try to push forward some kind of universal values? And there might not even be an interest. I mean, that might be part of the realignment here, is more of a license to countries. How do you see this playing out?
Well, in the previous panel, they talked a bit about the Russia data storage law, and that is sort of one method of reasserting internet sovereignty. And interesting, the same week that law was passed is when Trump, during the campaign, made his comment about how to counteract extremism online. And his response was that, in certain areas, we're going to have to close the internet up. And talking, in particular, he said he was going to talk to Bill Gates about closing areas of the internet up. So that's something for our colleague Carolyn from Microsoft to look forward to. But
I think he still has a key.
But a thing that he's discussed frequently, a frequent theme in his rhetoric, is this idea that you don't have a country if you don't have borders. That he has this kind of like hermetically sealed idea of what a nation state is, that full control of the people and capital that cross the border, that if you don't have that, then the state doesn't exist, that you're a failed state almost. And it's, I think, and I would say that from what we've heard of internet and the comment I just mentioned, that he kind of sees that too. And I think around the world we're seeing governments, rather than seeing the internet as something separate from international politics, from this kind of meta-national metaphysical force, that the internet is bounded, is balkanized, is separated by borders. And it seems just from the little he's discussed this idea that this is a kind of idea that this president would be sympathetic to, which is going to be a big shift from what we've discussed before, which is the American idea of the internet having the sort of same internet universally, which is something foreign governments have criticized as just saying, everybody has America's internet.
Yeah. How do these issues play out in China? And I don't want to make it all about Donald Trump. But clearly Trump's nationalism might make people in Beijing grappling with these issues think maybe differently about how the U.S. approaches these issues. And then even before that, all the revelations about American surveillance programs, did they play a role in the Chinese leadership being able to say, aha, you can get off your high horse, America, like we're all kind of in the same business here? And just help us understand how some of these American internal dynamics that affect how Americans might govern and regulate the internet, then get discussed within China.
Maybe I just mention 2 points here. First one is that I was very surprised that a lot of the Chinese people I know support Trump. So there's I thought, for a country that really values education and, so like elitism, but then all of a sudden it seems like everybody's kind of, a lot of people, there's no poll numbers in China, obviously, on this topic. Maybe there's some newspaper online poll, but a big number supporting Trump. The second one is that I think that America's moral authority has definitely been declined since the Iraq War and also Guantanamo Bay. I think that I had one brushing with secret police in China due to my documentary work in China. So I think one thing to keep on citing during their question of interrogation of what I was doing in China was basically like, look, US does that all the time, so why can't we do it? So I think a lot of the authoritarian countries, they look at America as examples. So if America does something, and those governments will use that justification internally to justify their action towards its own citizens. So I think for me, I'm really apprehensive with the Trump administration, what the administration does in terms of promoting America first will impact other countries trying to emulate or even amplify what Trump is doing domestically.
They could promote a China first.
China, Xi Jinping has already, has ever since he came in power, he's been promoting this kind of Chinese dream. He essentially is like going to promote the China first vision. But then, I think with the ongoing conflict potentials in South China Sea and with Japan, so it might flare up more.
Ellery, another thing that we haven't mentioned is ICANN, and I'm not sure we should. But
Wait, I wanted to talk about that, though.
What's that?
I wanted to talk about Trump, but
yeah,
tell me what you want to know about ICANN.
You talk about Trump or ICANN. I mean, the choice is it's a tough call. But no, you can talk about how the changes here are playing out in terms of governance of the internet, and this quite. I mean, if I am one of the people that you're advocating for on Global Voices, would it be a good thing or a bad thing for the U.S. to be seen to play more of a role in regulating this space? I mean, I think we're back to this question of like, we don't have a referee that we can all kind of look to.
So I wanted to, this is a bit of a controversial point here, but the Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act is a really important cornerstone of innovation and the technology industry in the United States, and I think I can say the world, because of how big and powerful and influential companies like Google and Microsoft and Facebook are. And the thing about that section is that it strictly limits the liability that companies can incur for most of the speech that occurs on their platforms. So basically, it says you still have to worry about copyright. You're still responsible for content that's under copyright, and you're responsible for it's like technically federal crimes, but in practice, it's child pornography. That's those are really the two things that the companies actually have real robust systems for guarding against. And everything else, it's a wild zone. And it's really scary in a lot of parts of the world that you can threaten to rape someone or kill someone, you can threaten a woman's honor in any number of ways, and it either you can report that content to Facebook, but it might take them 3 days or 3 weeks, depending on who's in charge and what language the posting is in, for that content to get taken down, or maybe it won't get taken down. So I think, when I talk with my colleagues, for example, in Bangladesh, they are in a big debate together. Last year, Bangladesh shut down Facebook for 22 days on security grounds. It was shortly after the terrorist attack, the bakery. There was a lot of fear about what kinds of violence was getting incited on the platform, and a belief that it simply couldn't be handled fast enough. And it's also, they don't have a lot of sophisticated tools to handle the problem. So they just say, okay, we have to shut it down. That seems like a really bad response, but there was a debate that broke out between our Bangladeshi contributors. And the ones outside the country were like, this is crazy, Facebook needs to be turned back on. A couple of the ones in the country said, well, it's really nasty, and we feel scared. So there's, that policy has given us this space where speech really takes priority, and over sometimes the safety or the privacy of the individual. And I don't know, I don't think that there are clear solutions to that problem, but I think it's important to keep shining light on it, because it's a really, it's really scary to be in a position where you feel like because somebody else's speech needs to be free, you are actually silenced or put under imminent threat.
I'm still waiting for the Trump part. But
Oh, the Trump part. Well, I'm worried about. No, I guess I've been wondering. I mean, thanks to Twitter, I think Trump has really, he has developed a voice and taken. He wants to talk directly to the American people. He doesn't want to use the media to do it. I get it. But he's behaving in ways that there's other kinds of actors on Twitter that you might actually think twice and say, actually, I wonder if he's violating their terms and conditions ever. And I keep wondering what'll happen if that day comes. But it's interesting that the guy has used the platform as a bully. He's kind of a bully. Can be kind of a troll, and at the same time is kind of also seems to want to shut things down when they get dangerous. I'm not sure. I worry about his understanding of the First Amendment.
It is funny. We've had a number of presidents in a row who have sought to somehow communicate with the American people, getting around those pesky White House correspondents. And I mean, I'm old enough to remember when that meant like you'd bring in like local news anchor people, or do the sort of primetime address. But of course now he just tweets directly, and there's a fair amount of transparency there. It's a little scary at times. But Josh, do you have more thoughts on this, and then we'll get a couple questions.
Yeah, just going back to this idea of how borders in physical space and the internet interact. I've been working on a book for the past year or so looking at border changes and the creation of new states, and particularly looking at places where the map is kind of ambiguous. And it was sort of fascinating to see how digital space kind of interacts with those. I spent a lot of time on a Mohawk reservation on the US-Canada border, where a consistent problem is that in parts of town you are roaming in both countries. This is sort of a lifestyle issue for people who live there. And another issue, often in unrecognized or partially recognized states, when you're in them, they feel very much, you're very much feel like you're in a country. And often the only reminder I would get that the place I was in was a little different was when you log on to Google and you see which site you're getting. So, I was in Somaliland, which is in an autonomous region in northern Somalia, and they have Somali Google, and in Abkhazia, which is a breakaway region of Georgia, they still have Georgian Google. This has been an issue in Kurdistan, another place I visited. They've had an issue with domain names. They've been trying to get, they have a .krd right now, which is the three-letter names are usually for organizations. The two-letter names are reserved for countries, and actually in applying to ICANN, they got some pushback from the Iranian government, which has a significant Kurdish minority, actually citing the risk of serious political conflicts if this was recognized. And the head of the KRG government was promoting this move, saying that we live within these geographical boundaries, but they don't have the same leverage in cyberspace. So I just think it's interesting that we've gone from, as we talked about in the earlier panels, this idea of the internet being something that exists sort of separate from nation states and outside of physical space, to being one that kind of advances territorial claims, either by states over disputed regions or by breakaway regions that want to be states.
Right, that's fascinating. Couple of questions? We're right up on the 2 o'clock hour, but we can, up here. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Jack Rapansky, unaffiliated former software developer. I'm curious about some areas like civil society and protest in like Egypt and Ukraine and Russia in particular, in terms of they have all these laws now that make it difficult to protest and kind of shut down civil society. But what's going on in social media itself? Is that shut down, or is it even more active because they can't go out in the street?
depends. I mean, I think there's like each case is a little different, or is a lot different. In the case of Egypt, there's been a series of laws intended to limit civil society activity, and one of them is this really difficult law about getting a permit before you have a protest, and basically if the government doesn't want the protest to happen, you don't get the permit. So there is quite a lot of activity online in those communities. It's not all, those are, I would say, or at least from my vantage point, a lot of them are really technologically savvy communities, so they're not using the big corporate platforms. They're using quiet, smaller, encrypted services, open source stuff that they know the developers, they trust them. So that's kind of an answer, but I think there's a lot happening in different ways. There's also small meetings. There's different ways to think about pressure. So I think that that's happening a lot too.
Jim McCormick. Is that working? Also unaffiliated right now. This is a big question, I apologize, but where do you see technology fitting into all this as we see bots and we see aggregation of data, artificial news generated automatically? Any idea where that's going to take us?
How do you have a view on this?
I think as any new technology evolves, there's going to be different ways of using that technology for ends that the public might consider to be good or bad. But I think this is kind of natural. We're always going to be dealing with issues like this. So we're just going to, as a society, we have to decide on using legal framework or technologies to solve them. So I see that it's, after this wave, there's probably going to be another wave as well, especially as new technology emerging, like AI and other technologies as well.
We've talked about trolling a bit today and some of the ways in which states are using these technologies that we once thought, only civil society and individuals will be nimble at. Fake news is not something we've talked about, although, I mean, disinformation campaigns are nothing new. The ways in which we're talking about them are new. But Ellery, I don't know if you have something to add to this whole topic of fake news and disinformation and how it affects the people on your platform.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're in the US, it's a really hot topic because there's this fresh new recognition of a destabilization of trust in information. And that state of instability is really what a lot of the world has been living in for a long time. So I think I think it's important to, and what we're trying to do at Global Voices is just push examples out so people can kind of see. But it's really unnerving because, and especially when you think about the role of technology in generating or pushing certain kinds of information, machines still can't make really good choices about what is true or not. And I'm not sure that we'll get there. And I'm a little worried about even some of the consequences of us trying to get there. I know that is a goal for a lot of the artificial intelligence communities really interested in this problem. But it's sticky. Somebody back there.
And Slate's fighting against fake news. Yes. Okay, last question.
So the Czech government recently established an independent government agency to sort of police trolling and fake news about politicians in anticipation of their upcoming election. Do you feel the government getting into, even in an independent organization, sort of policing truth claims on the internet? Not necessarily policing, but like flagging when they see things that are not true about politicians. Do you think that's overall a good thing, or in general a bad thing because it sort of associates truth claims with political or politicization?
If you just say no, we're done.
Bad.
Yeah, I mean, well, I don't know too much about the specific Czech example, but I think there is like a danger when everything becomes fake news, and that label can be like weaponized by, as we're seeing in the US now, can be weaponized by governments as easily as it can by activists. So yeah, I would be very wary of initiatives like that.
Well, great. Well, thank you all for coming. Obviously, a very rich topic that we'll continue to follow. And thanks to the panel. Thank you.